Well, welcome everybody. Great to see everybody back, and lots of familiar names here. Good to see you guys coming back for our last session. This is it. Our last session that Justin and I are going to be doing in this 4-part series. And appreciate you joining in on with us for this one. We're going to be talking about adaptive management and just kind of going around the gamut of everything from moving animals, grazing systems, how to choose the best system to use, these types of things, going into some monitoring, and we'll finish up with some wildlife considerations on our land. So, hey, Justin, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic.
Awesome. Well, I think we're ready as people are coming in. You and I tend to run long. So we should probably get started as sooner than later.
It's
And
true.
I'll just turn it over to you, Justin, to kind of get us going.
Okay, sounds great, Lee. Um, but between Lee and myself, we never have uh, a shortage of things to talk about. We always have lots and lots to discuss.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we're really excited about doing this fourth session with all of you. And before I get started with my part of the presentation, I just kind of wanted to give you guys just a little bit of a preview of what we're going to be covering today. And so I'm going to lead off. I'm going to be taking the front half here, and then Lee will wrap us up. And I'm going to be getting into different grazing management approaches, different methodologies, and what those different approaches can do depending on what your goals and objectives are. And then we're going to kind of go back into what we were talking about in our session 2 from a month ago on those 4 dimensions of grazing management. We're going to bring that back into the discussion, and then how that folds into the art of adaptive grazing management. And so we're going to look at some livestock indicators in there, some plant indicators, kind of go through a few scenarios. And then we will have a final scenario at the very end that I'm going to be asking people to chime in the chat and give us your response and what you would do in the situation that I'm going to be providing at the very end of my part of the presentation. And then we're going to move into Lee's section, where he's going to be really focusing on different types of monitoring strategies. And monitoring isn't something that a lot of people discuss. It's usually not one of the most mentioned things when we're talking about grazing management. But Lee's going to really key in on the importance of monitoring and different ways to do it, because how do you know where you're at if you don't know where you've been? So we need that monitoring piece to know where we've been so that we can guide our future decisions. And then he's going to get into how to do some forage forecasting, looking at how to predict how much forage you may have in the next couple of months. And there's some cool technology out there that enables us to do that. And then he'll wrap it up in talking about how we can better manage for wildlife habitat. So with that, I'm going to get started. If you could go ahead and go to 2 more slides there, Carlos, for me. Yeah, and go 1 more. Okay, thank you. So what I kind of wanted to lead off with is something that should look fairly familiar to those of you who have been with us from the very beginning, or have seen at least sessions 1 and 2. And I I created this graph that places a lot of the what we would call common or fairly typical grazing management approaches, and it places them in relationship to each other. And on the horizontal axis, we have grazing frequency, which that's going to measure how often the same plants are being regrazed. And then on the vertical axis, we have grazing duration, which is going to measure how long livestock spend in one spot. And we know that the longer livestock spend in one area, the more frequently they end up grazing the same plants. And then I also put on there stock density on that vertical axis, which is going to be measuring how close livestock are to each other. So the closer livestock are to each other, the higher the stock density, right? And then that just correlates with generally with a shorter grazing duration. So, the more we pack the animals in a smaller area, the less time they can spend in that one area because the amount of forage that we're giving them, is very, very small. And I've taken the liberty to roughly place each of these major grazing systems on this graph, so that we can see how they kind of contrast according to the dimensions of grazing frequency, grazing duration, and stock density. Now, it's important to realize that where these different grazing systems sit in space, on this graph, is, this is just very relative, and since there's no numerical ranges for the definitions for a lot of these grazing systems. So, what we're just trying to do is place them kind of in rough relationship to each other. And, on the one end of the extreme, up in the upper right, we have continuous grazing, and that's a system where, the animals are just staying in the same spot. They've got access to a very large field, and those animals are going and, picking whatever it is that they want to eat. And that's a type of a system that's on one end of the extreme. And then we go to the other end of the extreme down in the lower left, and you're getting into things like high stock density grazing or ultra high stock density grazing, where the animals are really, really being managed at a very, very high level. And in a lot of cases, the animals are moving multiple times a day. I've even known of producers moving up to 8 to 10 times in a single day. And so that's the other extreme. And then we have these other little grazing systems like the short duration grazing. Another name for it would be like the management intensive grazing that came about, that was popularized in the 80s and early 90s, along with simple rotational grazing. Those kind of fall somewhere in between. Next slide, please. So a key point to emphasize with as we're going through here is that there is no one size fits all approach when it comes to different types of grazing management styles. And I want to just throw here just the three basic ones for simplicity. I mean, you could go out into the internet or into some manual, and you could dig up all sorts of other names for different types of grazing systems. And Lee and I didn't feel like we wanted to bore people to death by going over every single one and all the different the nuances between them all. So what I just decided to do is take more of a broad brush here, and just look at the three overarching types that are out there. So with continuous grazing on the left, okay, we see that animals are spending several months to all year in one spot. And then as we move to the right, as we go to more of a simple rotational grazing system, you take that continuous grazing system and you chop it up, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ways, and you get this simple rotation taking place. And here, for example, this is a 4 paddock rotation. So livestock are basically, spending a week in each paddock. And of course, this would be in an area where you get abundant precipitation or under irrigation where plants are growing quite rapidly. So, livestock are spending a week in each paddock, and then they move on to the next paddock. And then in a week later, they move on to the next one. And then so basically each paddock is getting about 3 weeks of rest. And then in the adaptively managed grazing system, this one is where the animals are usually being moved with portable electric fence so that that paddock size can be either enlarged or reduced on demand, because we're trying to keep the animals and only give them 1 day's worth of forage. And then the animals don't return until the plants fully recover. So there's no set time period. It's not like we're grazing on the calendar per se, but the only way animals come back is once plant recovery has fully taken place. If plant recovery is suffering and it's lagging behind, then the animals have to go someplace or be camped somewhere temporarily until the plants fully recover. So as we're talking about, the word adaptive, and I was kind of going, night or two ago, as I was thinking about, adaptively managed grazing, and I was thinking, what's the difference, between adaptively managed grazing when we hear that term and being proactive? And so I was kind of thinking, adaptive means that you see something negative happen, and you then counteract it with some action, right? You see something happen in the pasture, and then you're like, boom, okay, I got to do something about this. I got to take care of it, and so you respond to it right away. Proactive, and this is kind of more of a the actual definition of some of these words, but I was thinking, proactive means that you're thinking far enough ahead that you can actually predict with pretty good accuracy what's going to happen next if you stay on your current trajectory. So it's anticipating that something negative could happen if we don't act now before that negative thing happens, which means really, being proactive requires going through the adaptive phase first, right? You have to learn how to adapt to your system to be able to read the animals, the plants, the soils, and then be able to have a game plan of what you're going to do when you see certain things happen. But then, once you go through this for, a couple of years, then pretty soon you don't have to just respond to just negative things all the time. You can actually be proactive, and you can take care of things, make advanced plans so that those negative things never happen ever again. So that's where I'm just trying to kind of push the envelope here a little bit as we're talking about, adaptive grazing management. Is that ultimately what we want to be able to do is become more proactive in all of our efforts in the future, so that maybe we can be proactive 50% of the time. And then that way we avoid a lot of the pitfalls that can come. Next slide, please. So depending on the goals that we have as graziers, there's certain grazing approaches that allow us to more easily realize our goals. And that's because there's no one grazing system that's going to meet everyone's needs, because every grazier is different, right? Each grazing approach has its own inherent advantages and disadvantages. And I've often had people ask me, well, which grazing approach, which grazing system is the best one? And it's like, I can't give you that answer without us having at least a conversation about what your goals and your objectives are. My goal is not to shoot down any one particular grazing system or to bring, or to try to sell you on a specific grazing system. But it really comes down to is your lifestyle, your management style, the needs that you have personally and with your family. And if we're not taking all of that into consideration, then we're probably not going to be able to get matched up to the right type of grazing system that's going to meet all of your land, animal, and personal objectives. So what I decided to do in talking about this a little bit was just creating a simple chart um, that basically shows, okay, if you decide to if you have very limited ability to go out there and move portable fence, for example, or if you're really looking for, the minimal amount of fencing and water development costs, then you're probably going to be looking at something where, okay, well, I can't really move animals that well. I don't have anybody else here to do it for me. Uh, and something that resembles continuous grazing is, going to be something that's going to meet that goal of the lowest water cost, the lowest fencing costs, the lowest labor requirements. In fact, I would just say, really continuous grazing requires no labor requirements. I mean, because you're just leaving the animals there. One of the things that has been shown through a bit of research is that when we're looking at the rate of gain per head, and I'm going to make two different distinctions here: gain per head and gain per acre. They're two totally different measurements. But gain per head, the way that you get the best gain per head is you allow animals to be ultra selective, and continuous grazing allows that. It allows the animals to just pick and choose what they want at any time they want for months and months. But then if we start looking at, if we're actually trying to improve the rate of gain on a per acre basis, then we have to look at how the land is really being utilized. And we know under continuous grazing, the animals are cherry picking. They're just getting just the very tastiest stuff out there. They're not utilizing all the plants that are there. And because of that, you've got a lot of plants that are growing up that are capturing solar energy, but it never gets run through an animal. So you end up you get a lot of inefficiencies that way on a per acre basis. Whereas when we start looking at something that's going to be using more improved management, through something that's adaptively managed, where you're using, you're putting the animals in through a series of multiple paddocks, and you're moving at the rate at which plants are regrowing so that you don't overgraze, that's going to actually be much better from a rate of gain per acre standpoint. So we actually start capturing more of that efficiency on a per acre basis when we encourage animals to be able to take a bite on every plant, rather than just taking a bite on, only 5 or 10% of the plants, and then they're leaving the other 80-90% that are completely escaping the animals, and the animals want nothing to do with them because they're just getting so much more mature than that nice, fresh, tasty regrowth that they keep going back to. If we have the goal of trying to improve plant and soil health, if we're trying to improve plant diversity, then again, something that's going to require quite a bit more management is going to give us the flexibility to be able to do that. Pretty much most land that I've seen, and most of the land that I've seen in my career, has usually been cool season bunchgrass species dominant. So usually up on native rangeland, and also on irrigated pasture, where we're using orchard grass or meadow brome, a non-sod forming grass. Then, in situations like that, continuous grazing just really makes those pastures plummet. And eventually those pastures, irrigated pastures here, for instance, in Idaho and Montana, under continuous grazing, generally what you get is a binary mixture of Kentucky bluegrass and white clover, because those are both plants that can survive very frequent and severe grazing. Whereas your orchard grass, your meadow brome, your blue bunchweed grass, most of your bunch grass species can't survive that frequent and close grazing like a sod forming grass can. So for those of you down in the South, where you've got Bahia and Bermuda grass, those grasses, from what I understand, are pretty doggone tough. They can take quite a beating, and that's because those plants are sod forming plants and they carry their growth points very low, like our Kentucky bluegrass and our white clover do. So it really kind of depends on the vegetation that you have in your environment will respond to different styles of grazing management. The other thing too, and I kind of put these in here a little bit as an afterthought, but I was thinking, if you have the goal of being able to be around your animals, close to them, having them be calm. You think about when you got to gather animals and you've got to run them through the squeeze chute, or you've got to doctor them in any way. Animals, the more that you're around them, the more they positively respond to you. They get calmer, they get easier to work with. And that is very, very valuable when you are especially trying to doctor animals, you're trying to do vaccinations, stuff like that. Most of the times when I've gone and helped with vaccinations, it usually turned into a rodeo because the animals were rarely ever handled. And then you were piecemealing panels together with baling wire or baling twine, and things were not set up properly. And usually somebody's hand was getting hurt, or somebody was getting kicked, or something like that. It just wasn't a very good experience. And then, we get down to the ability of that grazing system to adapt. Of course, we're talking about adaptive grazing management here, but the flexibility of a grazing management system to be able to all of a sudden switch gears depending on what's going on. If you've got continuous grazing, how do you switch gears? Really, I mean, if you're not going to use the labor, if the labor is not available there, and you have very limited watering infrastructure, you're kind of stuck. You don't have a lot of flexibility in a system like that. It's very rigid. Whereas an adaptively managed grazing system, there's times when animals may be moved every single day, but there may be times when animals are only moved maybe once a week or every 2 weeks. It just depends on the time of the year and what's going on. So when we talk about adaptively managed grazing, we're not talking about moving animals once a day all year long. We're talking about, the management intensity. It ebbs and flows throughout the year depending on what's going on. And ultimately, we come down to, trying to improve long-term resilience. And of course, I think that's something that's on everybody's minds nowadays with all the weather extremes that we're seeing. We want our pastures, our fields to be sponges. We want them to be able to soak up every drop of water that comes their way. And so when we're looking at trying to improve that long-term resilience, continuous grazing isn't gonna give that to us if we've got a bunch grass dominant plant community. That's not going to happen. But if we've got something that allows us to be able to expand paddock size, shrink paddock size, move animals more frequently during periods of fast forage growth, and then slow things down when forage growth also slows down, that's going to give us the ability to actually improve the long-term resilience of the whole ranch or the whole farm over a period of time. Next slide, please. So when we talk about adaptive grazing management, what I kind of wanted to talk here a little bit about was, how do we do this in real time? There's, we can sit down at the kitchen table, we can kind of plan out how we're going to make our moves for the year or for the next couple of months, where the animals are going to go at certain key points in time. But when it comes down to, managing in real time, meaning on a day by day basis, I kind of liken this to, driving. We need to know whether we need to speed up, slow down, go straight, turn left, or turn right, right? Because when you're driving down the road, you don't just set the steering wheel and lock it in one place and the accelerator, keep it on cruise control indefinitely, because what's happening is the road's changing. The road curves to the left, curves to the right. There's other cars. You've got to make turns to get onto another road. So you can't just set everything up and go at the same rate without changing other things at the same time. So it has to be dynamic. So this is where we kind of get back to those 4 dimensions of grazing management. So we'll just review those real quick. So that's timing, duration, frequency, and intensity. So for each of these dimensions, what I'd like to propose is just one question for each one of those dimensions that helps us know if 1, 2, 3, or all 4 need to be modified at any given point in time. So let's take the dimension of timing first. So the question that we could ask is, are livestock arriving when plants are fully recovered? Okay, that's a pretty basic question, but boy, is that an essential question. Are livestock arriving when plants are fully covered? Now, you might remember from the last 2 sessions that, we're looking for grasses that are either in the elongation or the early reproductive growth phases. Okay, so one thing that I mentioned last time we talked about is, if the field looks like it's ready to be hayed, it's definitely ready to be grazed. But if it doesn't look like you wouldn't want to hay it because it's just too immature, then it may not be ready to be grazed because maybe it's still in the vegetative stage. So if we look at the second dimension of duration, we could ask the question, how long can livestock graze in this one spot while maintaining or improving plant, animal, and soil health? Or is there sufficient forage before livestock go into a field or a paddock? And is there enough leaf area remaining after livestock leave to regenerate the plant and keep the soil covered? That's a real key part. It's with the duration aspect, the real critical part there, folks, is what are we leaving behind to help regenerate the plant and to also feed the soil? If we're taking it down to 2 inches, we're not leaving anything there, right? And that's why I've always been an advocate of maintaining higher and higher residuals, higher and higher stubble heights, so that we ensure that the plant is able to regenerate itself very quickly, and also to keep the soil covered. Because we need to maintain that soil cover, because you just don't find earthworms just on bare baked soil, right? They like to be undercover. Your soil biology loves being undercover. And just like we got to wear clothes, the soil wants to wear clothes too. And you don't want to see your soil very often. You want to see it covered up. So I underline the word "and" on this question to draw attention that we need to be addressing the health of the plants, animals, and soil. It's not just 1 or 2 of the 3. if we're going to truly have a regenerative grazing operation that's going to be resilient to weather extremes that we're seeing more and more of these days. So that word "and" is really, really critical, improving plant, animal, and soil health, all three at the same time. For the dimension of frequency, we could ask, are livestock returning before plants are fully recovered? Or are plants getting overrested? Overgrazing and overrest are both detrimental to plant health and future forage production. And I oftentimes in a grazing context, it's rare that I see overrest, but oftentimes, especially out here in the West, where we have, for example, the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, where animals are usually kept out of that on purpose. It's highly erodible land. It's put in permanent perennial vegetation. And the times that I have visited CRP fields, I've usually found where you've got plant material there that's been oxidizing. It's just been laying dead for a year or more. In fact, the old plant material is turned gray, and in a lot of cases, when you look at the crowns of the plants of the bunch grasses that are there, because there's no animal there to periodically prune that vegetation to utilize it, those plants are actually starting to die. And then that just goes to show that, grasses, forbs, legumes, they require animals to be grazing on them periodically. Otherwise, the old growth is never removed, and then that becomes that actually stifles future plant productivity. For the final dimension of intensity, we could ask, how uniform is the field receiving animal impact from either grazing, trampling of ungrazed forage, hoof impact on bare soil, and fouling with manure and urine? So the intensity, which is, we measure that through the metric of stock density, it directly affects the uniformity of animal impact. So the higher that stock density is, usually we're going to see, either plants have either been grazed, they've been trampled, they've had a hoof impact on anywhere, on basically hoof impact on the whole thing. But where we have bare soil, you'd actually see where the animal hooves actually kind of chipped the soil there a little bit, broke up that crust. And then also looking at manure deposition on that field. Next slide, please. So when we look at the art of adaptive grazing management, that really means using our powers of observation to recognize the subtle deviations in animal, plant, and soil health, and then to respond appropriately and immediately by altering one of the 4 dimensions of grazing management to prevent a deviation from causing long-term damage. As this is done repeatedly, pretty soon that art of adaptiveness becomes the art of proactiveness, where changes to one or more of these 4 dimensions prevents the deviations that were previously observed and therefore avoided altogether. So each of the dimensions can be altered in varying degrees to address certain situations. And so I had a little bit of fun creating these kind of like, like a dial, like what you'd have almost like on a stove. You can fluctuate, you can turn these dials different directions, all independently of each other, depending on what you're trying to do. And I kind of make this analogous a little bit to, you think about if you've ever watched a symphony or an orchestra, and, it takes all different members in that orchestra to create the beautiful music that you hear. An orchestra isn't just composed of just pure strings. It's not just violins. It's not just, trumpets or the percussion, the drums. It's all of them working in concert. And the job of the conductor is to harmonize all of those together at the same time. You could also say, this is like juggling, right? You got 4 balls in the air, and you are just trying to keep all 4 balls. You're trying to prevent the balls from landing on the ground, and so it's all balancing act is what you're doing, and that's really the art of adaptive grazing management. So let's briefly review what the indicators we're looking for. Next slide, please. So from an animal standpoint, we're going to be looking at animal behavior. We're going to be looking at room and fill and manure scores. Next slide, please. And then from the plant standpoint, we're going to be looking at the amount of forage that is there before the animals go in to a field. We're going to look at the amount of forage that's either standing or trampled after grazing. And then we're also going to be looking at the rate of plant recovery. So we're going to be looking at a lot of different things, and I'm just hitting the highlights here. But these are all things that we're watching, that we're monitoring for, to be able to know what we need to do next. If we need to stay on our current trajectory, or if we need to modify one or more of those 4 dimensions as we're going along. Next slide, please. So if we're looking at animal behavior, and we turn animals into a new paddock, and they begin grazing immediately at the opening of that new paddock instead of walking in calmly and exploring that paddock, then that can that's generally caused by not having enough forage for the time allotted, right? The paddock was too small, or the livestock weren't moved soon enough, and so you're keying in on their behavior. It's very normal for animals, once they come into a new paddock, if they've been satiated and very satisfied in the prior paddock, they'll leisurely walk in. They won't and they won't drop their heads immediately right at the very entrance. They'll take their time. They'll come in. They'll explore their paddock a little bit, and so if we see this behavior, and also, if we see rumens, if we look at the left side of the animal on that triangle, like I was talking about 2 weeks ago, if it's sunk in on several of the animals, or if we're seeing that the animals are generally losing condition, this all goes back to that, the animals are not getting enough groceries, right? So we need to either arrive sooner, or we need to give the animals a larger area. And so that's where those 2 little dials there on the right, we're looking at either arriving sooner, so a shorter grazing duration, if we're not going to change the paddock size, and if the forage quantity, the forage mass, and the paddocks are relatively the same of what they're going into, then we need to shorten up that grazing duration so that they don't eat too far down into the paddock. And then also, we may need to give the animals a larger area so that they've got more access to more forage, if we're not willing to arrive sooner to get them moved. Next slide, please. So if we see runny manure scores 1 and 2, again, what could be the cause of that? And we talked a little bit about that 2 weeks ago. So that's where we're looking at, well, if we've got plants that are in the vegetative growth phase, well, plants in the vegetative growth phase usually have excess protein, very little fiber. So the logical solution would be, if we have that available to us, is to get the animals on more mature forage instead of having them be on that very young vegetative plant material. Another cause for running manure, it might be that the animals are grazing too lightly on the plants that are in the elongation or the reproductive growth phase. So those plants could be there, but the animals are just not being encouraged to eat on them. And so we may look at, well, maybe what we need to do is is get those animals on a smaller area and shorten up the grazing duration so that we encourage them to not be as selective and to start eating a little bit on all the plants there, which can help to thicken up their manure. Carlos, go ahead and skip probably about skip to the slide where you see the Jersey cows in the background on pasture. It's about another 5 more slides. Slide 16. Thank you. So what I wanted to also cover here is that different animal classes have different nutrient requirements. So if we're looking at, animals that are more in maintenance mode, they're not being sold off the farm or the ranch. Their job is to have a baby, but not gain a whole bunch of weight to be sold, for direct market or wherever those animals would go. So animals that are in more of a maintenance type mode have lower nutritional requirements. So, a dry cow that does not have a calf at her side, she's either going to be in, second trimester. She has very low requirements. But if we're trying to finish animals on pasture, and this is using the scale of relative forage quality. So the higher that scale goes, the higher the nutrient requirements are for those animals. So a finishing animal or a dairy animal has very, very high nutritional requirements. And so those animals are a lot less forgiving of our mistakes if we make a mistake, because the quality of diet that they have to have is much, much higher compared to an animal that is like in their second trimester and they don't have a calf or a lamb at their side. Next slide, please. So earlier this week, I was on a walkabout and I wasn't feeling very well because actually I'm just recovering from COVID for the second time. And I was out just walking around and I saw this field from a distance. And I thought to myself, boy, the animals are probably going to be, be very loose. Their manure is going to probably be very loose. That stuff looks really, really leafy. And there's no old grass there because the owner actually burned off all the old grass about a month ago, and it's been hayed. There's really no legumes out there. And he's got 5 yearlings on about 8.5 acres, and it's split into 3 paddocks. And the paddock that you're looking at there is about 3.3 acres. So I just using my eye, I just estimate, there's probably about 10 to 14 inches of growth in there. And so when I got closer to it, I was like, oh, well, actually, this doesn't look too bad. Next slide, please. So I was thinking that, most of the plants were either in the vegetative or the elongation growth phases. But when I got closer, I could see actually most of the plants were either in the late elongation or the early reproductive growth phase. But the plants were stunted. And the way that I knew that the plants were stunted is I looked at the same species of plant just 20 feet away on the other side of the fence that wasn't under the same treatment as this pasture. And so, on where the pasture was, the orchard grass was, 10, 12 inches tall. But then on the other side of the fence where I was at, it was like 30 inches tall. So that kind of helped me to know, that, obviously, we've got some stunted growth here. These plants aren't doing as well as they should. And so let's go to the next slide, please. But then I started walking the fence line a little bit. I didn't want to trespass out there, so I just looked at what I could see from where I was standing, and I started looking at manure. And I saw at least 5 or 6 manure pats that were there, and you're seeing the pictures of some of the ones that I was seeing, but pretty much every single manure pat that I was seeing was scoring between a 1 and a 2. So then I was thinking, the question I want to kind of ask all of you is, how can you be getting manure scores of a 1 and a 2 when there are a lot of plants that are in the elongation or early reproductive growth phase? So think about that for a moment. You've got the right type of plants in there at the right type of growth stage, but you're still getting this runny manure. And if they're having manure that's running like this, that's going to be interfering with them being able to gain weight, right? When we talked about the metabolic issues that occur when animals are eating a diet that's fairly excess in protein, which then triggers the manure to look like this eventually. So really, I kind of looked at it, it's all a forage allocation issue is what it comes down to. So in this case, the pasture is being misallocated in the case of there's far too much forage being offered for just 5 yearlings. So having so much more forage than what 5 yearlings really need allows livestock to be really, 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 really picky, right? And what they want most. And so what are those animals going after? They're going after the young and tender grasses in the vegetative growth phase. So during periods of rapid forage growth, like right now, this is my favorite time of year because I can just literally practically be standing there and watching the grass grow. So this time of year, livestock, they can revisit the same plant to get a new bite of regrowth every 4 days, right? So this is how livestock can perpetually graze a vegetative growth phase diet for quite a long time while all the plants around them are maturing. Because as I was looking at it, I was like, there's a lot of stuff here that's in that late elongation phase and early reproductive phase. It's short, but it is, it's further along in development. But the livestock aren't enticed to eat the more mature growth because it's not as soft and tender as the stuff that's young and vegetative. We were told when we were little children, you got to eat your vegetables to have ice cream. You're not going to get in dessert unless you eat your vegetables. And the more mature growth are like the vegetables in this example, and it represents a more balanced meal compared to just ice cream. Even though as kids, we'd rather eat ice cream over any vegetable, and the livestock would rather eat the short and tender stuff all day long. So if we're seeing this take place in our pastures, how can we adapt our grazing management to correct the nutrient imbalance that we're seeing in all the running manure? Two more slides, please, Carlos. So this is what it kind of came down to for me, is that to correct the situation, I would need to reduce the paddock size down to what the livestock will non-selectively graze. So I don't want them to be picky anymore. I want to get it so that they are going to be way less selective, so that they're encouraged to graze the mature forage that is there, and then also to stop the overgrazing, because there's a whole lot of overgrazing taking place in that pasture. This takes some experimentation and observation, but to find the right paddock size that's going to work, it really shouldn't take longer than a few days to figure it out. It's just a little bit of trial and error. And I found, daily paddocks appropriately sized for the number of head works best to minimize selective grazing. And what it really comes down to, folks, is that our top priority for the livestock, it's to provide a balanced meal all year long. And if we do that, animal performance will always be good. If we don't pay attention to making sure that they have that balanced meal, that's where we can get into a lot of metabolic issues, lower rates of gain, losing body condition, things like that. So with that, that concludes my part of the presentation. Lee, I will hand it off to you now.
Okay. Well, thanks. I think that, I always enjoy the conversations that Justin and I have, whether we're doing it like this with a bunch of other people, or whether we're just on the phone having our weekly discussions about grazing systems. But I like how he covered the concepts of adaptation and adaptive management here, and using observation, because pardon, what we're going to look at right now is taking that observation element and kind of trying to systematize it a little bit. Justin said that this is monitoring. What we're going to talk about right now has often been something that's been overlooked, and I agree. It's been overlooked by a lot of producers, myself included, because you just don't have time sometimes. Or you think you don't have time. You're busy doing other things. But go ahead and push us to the next slide there, Carlos. What what we can see that happens whenever we develop some type of monitoring system is a systematized way for us to be able to know where we are, right? And from where we've been. We're putting these different types of management practices on the land, and we really want to know, what direction is this sending us? What's my trend here? Am I going up or down the scale based upon my goals? And so the important thing to know in having some type of system where you can actually monitor the biological integrity of what's going out on the land, is that you can be as simple or as complex as you want to. Again, this is going to be based upon your goals and time constraints and how much you want to dig into it. And we're going to cover a couple of those. We're going to cover, ways to, measure key forage species, to figure out paddock composition, using things like photo points or transects, or various other ways to count actually what's out there, so that we can make decisions. That's what the whole thing is about, is to be a feedback mechanism so that we can make decisions on the ground. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so what we need to do whenever we start to decide, okay, I'm going to develop a monitoring program, some way to capture what's going on out there. What is it that I'm desiring? What is it that I want to see, and what do I not want to see? So that's really going to help determine how you collect information and the type of system that you use. Perhaps you want to increase your carrying capacity. Perhaps you want to measure digestible energy or something like that. Maybe you want to track species diversity across your pastures. And we also need to know what we don't want, right? Maybe we don't want invasives. We don't want to see bare soil. So we've got a ground here of where we want to go, and we have an idea of what we want to look for, and that's going to help determine what type of system that we use. Go to the next slide, please. So monitoring. The whole point basically is just to develop that feedback loop. And probably one of the simplest ways to do this, and I know a lot of folks do this, I do it here even with my vegetable crops and stuff. I use photo monitoring and stuff for my own use, because it's very simple. An iPhone takes a picture and it records the date, right? And it's awesome. But you can use a simple photo transect, perhaps by, making 100-foot intervals across your paddock or across your pasture, taking a two by two plot looking straight down. And then after you do that, go back up and take another one looking straight ahead, so you get a perspective, you get an idea, date those pictures, and maybe even write down a notebook. It's like, okay, what did you see there? What are some of the things that you notice there that stand out in the photographs as you're walking around. Perhaps it's like, oh, there's a lot of grass here. We have a weed patch here, and so you can keep those photos, and then you can come back again as the year progresses and as the years progress, and you can compare these over to time to give yourself a picture of kind of like, what's the trend? What are the results of my management? And then some some other methods that we could use involve a little bit more data collection. And this actually is probably one of my favorite things. After I really learned how to do this, this is probably one of the favorite things that I can do by myself or with a bunch of ranchers out on the field, is to do some data collection. I have never seen ranchers light up. You can see a visible like light bulb go off over their head whenever they get down on their hands and knees and start picking apart and looking and doing plant ID and trying to calculate percent composition of a certain species. It's really amazing how much you learn, and how fun it is and how exciting it is to find out exactly what's going on in your pastures whenever you get down on your hands and knees. So we'll talk about a point step method and a couple of others. We'll talk about the Daubenmire transect, which is my own personal favorite, but there's so many. And whenever we send out the resource list tomorrow, it's going to come with a link to a monitoring guide with about 13 to 15 different different methodologies of how you could do this, and pick which one works best for you based upon what you want to count. Some other things that I've looked at, ring tosses, right? Toss a ring out and count how many plants are in it. Write it down in a notebook. Troy Bishop is some of you might know him. He writes for On Pasture. He is a grazing specialist up in New York State with Conservation District in Madison County, and does an awful lot of work with grazing management. And I was with him one time, and we were doing a dart method, and he just takes a dart, like a lawn dart, and he throws it out, and then whatever it hits, he writes it down. And then he'll go and he'll do this like 50, 100, 200 times across the field randomly. And whatever that dart touches, he writes it down, whether it's a weed or bare ground or a cool season grass or whatever. And then he gets his data that way. And so you get to play lawn darts and you get to do monitoring. And so I thought that was really cool. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk about point step a little bit, because this is kind of similar to Troy Bishop's dart method, but this is the point step is actually where you kind of put a mark on the tip of your boot, and that's kind of your sampling point. And so as you walk across the field, you'll take like 5 paces, and then you record whatever falls directly beneath the mark on your foot, right? So you do this, and you can kind of you can do things like figure out ground cover. You can figure out percent composition, like I've done right here. For instance, you know, every time you walk across and you hit a perennial grass, put a little check mark, total them all up at the end, and you've got a percent composition for that paddock at that time. And then you can come back and you can look at that the next month, or you can look at that the next year, and you can start to see what's changing. Because one thing that I have noticed is that whenever, and certainly Justin alluded to this as well whenever he was talking about the pasture that he visited last week, right? You look across the field and it looks one way, but then whenever you get into it, it looks different, right? It can look different the closer you look. So getting something like this, where you can do a point step method transect, and you can count and actually come up with a percent composition, it can help calibrate your eye, because you can look at the field and go, wow, I didn't think that was, you know, 26% perennial grass there or something, right? So it can really calibrate you so that the next time you look at the field, you have a better idea of what you're looking at. Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So this next one is the Daubenmire transect, and I'm particularly close to this one because this is one I was taught to do when I was a county agent in Montana. Taking some, and then I would take ranchers up into the field and I would do monitoring on different ranches with this system. And it's really cool because it's not as subjective as, say, you know, like the DART method or something like that. It's a little bit more complex. It's easy to follow, but it tends to remove any type of bias that you can have from like subjective pacing. So you're actually running a transect out, which is like 100 or 200 foot tape that you just run out, and then at the beginning, at the end of the transect, you paint a metal stake and drive it into the ground. And I used to take a GPS waypoint, and I would GPS that point so that I could go back out and I could find it like the next year, right? And so then I could run the transect at the same spot, and then I could actually monitor the same area and look at changes in that area over time. So this one here is where this Daubenmeier transect is really great for doing canopy cover and species composition and frequency, like how often the plants show up. These are really good things to know whenever you can track them. These are taken you know, at systematic points along the tape, and you basically take a vertical reading over the top. You'll see that there is a cover class frame on the right hand side of your screen right there, and that frame is 20 centimeters wide by 50 centimeters long, and it is divided with these black, you know, it was like black tape is what we did on ours. We made them out of PVC and we put black tape around them, measuring off, putting it into 4 quarters. And then you'll see the bottom right there, there's a 71 millimeter square right there. That square represents 1 to 5% of cover class. And then the bottom quarter is 25%, and then you'll see up to 50%, and then the white area up towards the top represents 75%, and then the whole frame would represent 100% cover class. And so that's going to be really important. So if we're going to be looking at how to measure cover and composition and frequency, we can use a frame like this. And so we'll run the tape out and say at 10-foot sections, or 2-foot sections or 4-foot sections, however you determine how frequent you're going to do this, you'll place this along the right or left side of the tape, and you'll just make it consistent that you do it the same way every time, right? And then you'll put it in, and then you'll start looking at species, and you'll be looking at canopy. So essentially what you're going to want to do is take and if you're looking down at a plant that's within this Daubenmeier frame, you just take and you see that there's a plant canopy, and you project that canopy down to the ground as you're looking vertically, and you estimate that species plant composition, that, you know, the percent cover based upon how it fits within this Daubenmeier frame. So if I know that I have just a few of them, the 71 centimeters by 71, if it looks like all of one species can fit in there, that would be a cover class 1, right? If it would fit into the 25%, the lower quarter, then that would be a cover class 2. And so what this person here has done on this Daubenmeier data collection form is, if you look at species 1 here, the AGSP, on the first quadrant, they had, on the first quadrant, they had a cover class of 2. There was none in cover in the second quadrant, because then they moved it, right? You move it and you do it again, then you do it again. In the third quadrant, there was a cover class of 1. And so he just went on, and then for all the species of plants that he found there, he assigned it a cover class based upon how that cover was perceived within this Daubenmeier frame. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So then what you do after that, because you collect all the data, and that's half of the fun, is just being down there and counting the plants, identifying what the plants are, um, giving yourself a good estimation of what the cover class is, and then you complete that form with the cover classes for each species, for each quadrant, and then you can transfer that to this summary sheet. And you'll notice on the left hand side you have your cover classes 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6, represented from 1 to 5%, 5 to 25, 26 to 50, and on down, right? So if you look at the first species there, the AGSP, there was 10 quadrants where the cover class was what was a cover class 1. There was 5 quadrants where there was a cover class 2. There was 2 quadrants where the cover class was 3, and there was 1 class where the cover class was 4. And so he wrote those down there and did that for the rest of the different plants throughout all the quadrants. And then here's a little bit of the fun math part, because basically what you do here is you just take the number of counts, say on the first line for cover class 1, there's 10 on the number, you multiply it by the midpoint of the cover class, which is 2.5, being a midpoint of 1 to 5%, and it gets you a product of 25. So you do that for the rest of the different quadrants, and you come down and add up a total canopy there straight down at 237.5. So that's the total canopy. You take that and you divide it by 50, which is the total number of quadrants that this person had, and it gives you a percent canopy cover of 5, which basically means that this species of plant on this transect, on this whole transect, which represents this pasture, covered 5%, was 5% of the canopy cover, is what it's telling you, right? And then to figure out species composition, you just took that canopy cover of 5%, and you divided it by a total of all the canopy covers for the rest of all the quadrants, which is 32, if you were to add them all up. And you multiply that by 100 and you get 15.6 and round up to 16. So this basically is telling you that for this plant species represents 16% of the population of this transect, which represents the paddock. So you can figure out, wow, 16% of what's out there are this plant species. And then the 36 basically on the frequency is dividing the number of quadrants that you have where the species was observed, and then you divide it by the total quadrants you have and you get 36. So that's telling you basically that this plant species was represented in 36% of all of the quadrants. And so it gives you, again, a numerical estimation of actually what's going on out there. And so why I really liked this type of thing where you actually quantify what's going on out there with monitoring is that it really helps to calibrate your eye, because it tells you something that you didn't think before. I remember being out in upland fields in Powell County, Montana, and you look across the field, and then we would be saying, well, how much bare space do you think is out here? So we walking around just looking across the field, looking down, and we'd say, oh, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15%, maybe 50%, we don't know. We did some work like this with the transects, and we actually included bare ground within our cover estimations, and we learned that this pasture that we were walking in was 35% bare ground. And it was like, whoa, it doesn't look like that. But I calibrated my eye so that as I looked at it, I knew kind of what 35% bare ground looked like. So again, I think that was the fun of it. It was really a learning opportunity. And it's something that I've recommended farmers do it maybe once a year, or once every couple of years, certainly just to calibrate your eye, and then just to get some quantitative information on what are the changes that are taking place based upon the management that I'm putting on the ground. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so there's other ways to do it, right? We have these really cool and fun ways where we go out and we count, we get on our hands and knees, and we have a plant ID book, and we're looking at the different plants out there, and we're counting them and doing stuff with tools and frames and measuring tapes, and that's an awful lot of fun. But there's quicker ways to do it too, and that's with some of these applications and programs that are out there. And some of you may have used things like Pasture.io or Maya Grazing. Those are two great for fee paid type programs that you could use to help to do stuff like estimate what's going on with the amount of forage that you have out there. What I like about the Pasture.io one is it has a predictive feed wedge in there, and will actually forecast pasture growth. And we'll go in on the next slide a little bit into how that's done. But that can be a great way to kind of like, have a monitoring and assessment system like at your fingertips on your smartphone. Maya Grazing does similar things, especially helping you to calculate and forecast that carrying capacity, which is so. And I'm gonna have some of these resources that I'm gonna send out tomorrow as well. So to recommend you guys look deeper into it. But one that we're working with the Soil for Water project right now is Land PKS. And this one was done by ARS, I believe. And this one is great. It's free. And it's basically it's all done by satellite and such, and you enter information in the app based upon your soil type and this, and then it'll help you to monitor soil health, habitat, any land management, farm record keeping, and these types of things. It's really pretty powerful. I use it here on my place with my vegetable crops and such, and it's a lot of fun. It's a fun way to monitor my soil health and my land cover, and how much, and especially cover crops and things like that. So those are some really good ideas for you to to look at some of those machine learning, type of applications. Let's go to the next slide, please. So things like Pasture.io, uses basically greenness indices in order to do the measurements that they do. So they can measure pasture cover, and they can even measure growth rates. They can even measure when the leaves are going to emerge, right? And so with this, it can really help you to predict what you need to do down the line. The cool thing about this is that they use these four, like Pasture.io uses these four different vegetation indexes, right? They use one called NDVI, which is comparing your near infrared and red light. And so this is a system that measures for healthy green vegetation. So what you're seeing here is like, it'll measure pasture cover, and it'll represent it from red to green to blue. So red being less cover, green being optimal, and blue being a lot of cover, right? So this is how it does it. It does it by using these color indices. It uses enhanced NDVI and compares the green and the red and the blue light, and assesses crop health. Oh, excuse me. And then it has also an enhanced vegetation index that is really responsive to like how the canopy looks and the way the canopy is projected. And with this application, it's really helpful to analyze stress in plants and changes that may be related to drought or such like that. And then the other one that Pasture.io uses is the soil adjusted vegetation index to assess areas where the soil surface is exposed. So this imagery here that they use is made even more relevant with the addition of the management activities that you do, that you're going to input into the system, as well as the weather information that it downloads. And so what this does is that the more data that you put into it and that it uses, it calibrates the system as a machine learning tool, right? And it makes the images a lot more meaningful. So that's one of those things that the more you use it, the better it becomes. So with those, that you can visualize pasture cover, plant growth rates, leaf emergence, and things like that. So those can be good tools to as a part of your monitoring program. So in the last couple of minutes here, what I'd like to do is I'd like to just shift gears and talk about wildlife for a little bit. And so we'll go to the next slide, Carlos. And this one, wildlife is pretty pretty important to me personally, because we know that livestock have been a destructive force on landscapes. It's a no-brainer. They have been, but they don't have to be. And there's many producers who are, doing wonderful things with wildlife habitat on their land. But the point is that agricultural landscapes are habitat for wildlife, right? Um, and the ecology of the agri-ecosystems that they live on have changed over time due to many different things: exotic species, invasive species, the removal of large carnivores, and human encroachment. And so it makes our agricultural landscapes even more important for wildlife, and the decisions that we make, can really be important to these creatures that live with us. So we've seen in our prior webinars that the functionality of these ecosystems on farms is largely dependent on plant and animal biodiversity. The functional ecosystem processes and the services that we get from them, like soil and water quality, regeneration of soil and plant organisms, nutrient cycling, these types of things are all facilitated by biology, and that necessitates the maintenance of biological integrity through our management. So it's also not surprising that adaptive grazing, like Justin was talking about, has been found to be a really effective conservation practice on grazing lands for protecting water quality and soil carbon and fertility and all of those types of things. And, there's a lot of research by Richard Teague, Sung Park, Mac Barnes, among others, who have showed this to be true. But there's another aspect of biodiversity that is every bit as important as soil and plant organisms, and that's wildlife that live on the land. Livestock and wildlife both compete for landscape resources. They both put pressure on the forage available, as well as for water, cover, and space. In fact, Matt Barnes has noticed that wildlife species often require considerably greater amounts of space than domestic animals to achieve acceptable levels of reproductive performance, right? So that the survival of their population is assured. So birds are going to need cover and shelter during their reproductive phase. Deer and elk need forage, cover, and water. They need a range large enough for them to thrive. Small mammals need space and protection from predators. Fish need quality streams and ponds. And the concepts of resource supply and demand and animal demand are just important for wildlife as they are for livestock. And so this affects our grazing management, which is why I always suggest that people put wildlife in their grazing management plan and account for that use. So what are we managing? Let's take a look at an example from the world of birds as we go to the next slide. So with birds, we have several different kinds of birds out there. We've got grassland obligates that nest directly on the ground, they're in open grasslands. And these include birds like the eastern meadowlarks, the bobolinks, the grasshopper sparrows, things like that. And we have shrubland birds, and they nest off the ground in low-lying vegetation, like in woody shrubs or places where there's sturdy wildflowers. And these can be like things like the golden wing warbler or the flycatcher, snipes, the dark-eyed juncos, things like that. In eastern grasslands, the most vulnerable grassland birds are the eastern meadowlarks, the grasshopper sparrows, and the bobolinks, which have all seen population declines of 75, 68, and 65% respectively since the 70s. And that's a big percentage of their population, right? And you can just imagine why, because of all of the management and that we as farmers and then do on the landscape, as well as all the other multiple uses that we have for our for fields and pastures. Let's go to the next slide. So, so we look at this and we go, okay, well then what am I trying to achieve? How can I get wildlife management as a concern into my whole farm plan? And, so we're going to, if we want to achieve soil, benefits in soil health, or increases in plant biodiversity and animal production and finances, wildlife can be another one of those goals that we have. Because if you look at the chart, and I put this chart in here for a reason, because if you look at the one at the section on the right under higher value, a lot of those things, most of all of those elements right there, are not only good for the soil, for biodiversity, for your finances, for animal productivity, but they're also a very high value for wildlife habitat on ag lands. And so that's why it's again really important not to maximize just one thing, not just to maximize biodiversity or your finances or animal productivity or wildlife. All of these things really kind of come in together, and wildlife management actually can function as a farm goal and fit so well within the farm ecosystem, because much of what you're trying to do in managing for good agricultural lands, especially for grazing, is going to benefit wildlife in some way. Let's go to the next slide. So what are some of the things that you can do, right? I always like to say, well, the first thing you can do is implement the 5 soil health principles that we talked about in session 1 so many weeks ago, right? Those 5 soil health principles really will be able to start getting that diversity going and maintaining a system that starts to benefit wildlife habitat, just like it benefits everything else on the farm ecosystem. But all of these practices that are listed here on the right, these are basically, practice standards that NRC uses for equip contracts, right? And what I like about this is because you take these practice standards and they've kind of ranked them here onto their habitat potential for fish and wildlife, for both food, cover, water, habitat continuity, and the total effect on the system. And you can look down there and see that, like, conservation cover practice standard, rates really high on the total effect. So does riparian forest buffers, so does riparian herbaceous covers, so does hedgerow plantings. What this is telling us is a lot of times things that we can do on the periphery of our field can bring in so much benefit for wildlife, for grassland birds, as well as for shrubland birds and for mammals as well. So I like to think that those borders are areas that we can really kind of increase wildlife habitat, but it also increases things like beneficial insects and pollinators as well. So let's go to the next slide. So so how do we incorporate then adaptive grazing? Like, let's say with birds that are nesting on the ground, right? We have to realize that our most productive lands that we have our livestock on are going to be critical for wildlife at some time of the year. And so that's why I put this little graph up here that basically talks about, when are grassland birds really at risk, based upon what we're going to be doing out there for agriculture. And that's a difficult thing, because each site is unique, and it's hard to say, here's how we incorporate adaptive grazing with ground nested birds, because we need answers. And since each site is unique, those answers, what may work on one field may not work on another, or what may work on one management plan won't work on another. So some of the things that I think we can actually start thinking about, though, if we want to manage a grazing system such that we can take care of ground nesting birds, is just, I mean, we can have certain areas of livestock grazing where we graze, and then the rest of it is open for part of the year, right? Say larger areas during July where the birds may be nesting could be open, and we can bypass that with the rotation. That might work in some situations. We can delay our field maintenance until the midsummer. We can for fields that are like managed like annually, maybe once. The optimal time to manage those is usually in the very late winter, early spring. Because that's allowing you to provide that cover for overwintering birds in that really good habitat. And if you have to mow during the breeding season, because mowing often can be a really disruptive thing for ground nested birds, it's a lot of people will say that it is best to focus on smaller fields, because larger fields tend to be the types of fields that the birds want to come nest in. They'll have a higher density of those grassland nesting birds. You can manage fields in patches and leave various structure there for birds year round. And we know that adaptive grazing can really do a good job at that, especially by leaving so much residual on the fields. You can promote connectivity of larger expanses of grasslands between neighboring farms or between your fields. Remember, we talked about buffer strips and borders and field borders and riparian borders and things like that can be a great opportunity to do that. You can modify the cutting speed and pattern of the mowing. I like to say just start mowing a spiral from the inside out and let the rabbits run. I mean, we can, things like this that we can think about. So this is, I mean, there's a lot going on in managing these guys. And again, I think the thing to remember is that we don't have all the answers of how to graze our livestock regeneratively, productively, and manage wildlife at the same time. And so that's why it's, we have all of these different things we can try, making habitat, altering the way we manage various patches to keep a mosaic throughout the farm for most of the year as possible. Because what we're managing here is a really integrated system. And I'm going to go to the next slide. And this is a quick little video, maybe a minute or two of this that we'll watch. And I'll this is from Kim Barker. Kim didn't do it. He showed this to me at the Nat GLC conference in Myrtle Beach in December. He's a rancher from Oklahoma, and he showed this to us whenever we were at a session. And I just want to take a few minutes to watch what's going on here. So what we have here are starlings that are flocking. They look like they know what they're doing. Something like this is really hard to quantify. Like, what's the math behind this? What's happening? I think biology is amazing. And that was what Kim Barker was getting, the point that he was getting to whenever he showed this film to me for the first time, is that when you look at these starlings going in and out, they're doing it for a reason, and we don't know that reason. But the important thing to remember is this is what we're trying to manage. This is nature. And everything that we've been talking about for the last 4 sessions has been about being a part of nature and managing such a very complex organism, right? So this is what we're managing, folks. And what Kim said whenever he finished his presentation, he says, "This is what we're managing, folks. Don't mess it up." Thank you, Carlos. I think we can yeah, we can pause and move on to our evaluation, but I wanted to leave everybody with that that little movie that Kim Barker showed us, because to me, it really did bring it all together. This is what we're managing. This is the type of complexity that we're looking at. And right now, I think Carlos is going to share our evaluation, and we appreciate everybody completing our evaluation, so we can know how we did and how we can do better next time. And while people are doing that, I will open it up for if anybody has any other questions. Justin, how are things going? Linda, I noticed there's a lot of chats. Did all the questions get answered?
I'm still working on some of the questions.
Oh, very cool.
And maybe what we do, Lee, is there was a question I was going to respond to, but it's far easier to just talk about it rather
Yeah,
than
please do. Please do.
do single finger typing on an iPhone.
Well, now that I'm done, you can have the floor, please.
Okay, so there was a question that was posed about when plants are not in the elongation phase, which is often just a short period of the year, where should the livestock be? And I was going to try to respond to that by just going through my phone to type it all out with just using one hand and one finger. But why don't we just go ahead and address that if we've got a moment. My response to that is, we're looking at the elongation growth phase and also the early reproductive growth phase too. And so when you combine those two phases, and I say, even when the plant has fully headed out, you got a full-on seed head there, but it is still very green. The window of opportunity to utilize those plants can actually be quite a long time. The plants the quality doesn't necessarily go completely down through the floor, as those plants have been reproductive for several weeks, and in the cases like that, we can still maintain a very high nutritional profile for the animals as long as we lighten up the graze and not allow the animals to come through, get a bite or two on those uppermost leaves, and then move on to the next plant. And then as you're going through your rotation, then you end up kind of creating what's called a wedge, a grazing wedge, where you get staggered plant maturity taking place behind the animals, so that when you come back through on your second or your third graze, if you're in a higher precipitation environment, then things are going to be staggered, and it isn't like you're going to be trying to, it isn't like you're going to be stuck grazing, plants that have been reproductive for, like 2, 3, 4 months. So you can create that grazing wedge very easily, and And also depending on the type of animals that you have, if you've got animals that are more maintenance mode anyway, I mean, they don't have to have the rock star nutrition that a finishing animal is going to have. So it's all relative to what the animals are also requiring. So really, that window of opportunity to utilize those plants in the growth phase that we're preferring is actually wider than oftentimes what we think.
Cool. Well, thanks for that. Are there any other questions that did not get answered, or something that anybody else has before we log off? It is 7:34. We are officially done. And I don't want to keep people longer than what they need to be. But if you have a question, Justin and I don't mind sticking around to have a short discussion if you need. So no worries. Well, I know that some of you have said that you're not, receiving some of the materials that we send out. So if you are not receiving them, please just put your name in the chat. I can, I've got a couple of them taken care of, but I want to make sure that our email list is up, because tomorrow we'll send out the slides and the notes, and then the resource list as well. And so that you can go digging a little bit deeper on some of these concepts. And stay tuned. Again, these are all on the NCAT YouTube website. So on our YouTube page. So all three of the prior ones are up right now, and this one will be up by next week. So they'll all be there for you to look at again if you want, or share with your friends. And stay tuned, because Justin and I are going to do some more stuff as well. We're looking forward to doing more things like this. Certainly we're going to be doing podcasts and such. And if we can get together in the same state, we'd love to do a pasture walk too, and bring some folks out. So I really appreciate everybody, bearing with us for these 4 sessions. Justin and I got a lot out of it. We love doing this kind of stuff and talking about this and with folks. Linda Coffee, thanks so much for always being on the chat and helping out. Linda is our specialist in Arkansas and very knowledgeable on pasture and small ruminants, and always glad to have her here to help with the chat and some of the questions. So anything else for the good of the order, Justin?
Well, thank you, Lee, for taking charge on all this and for leading this latter half of the presentation. I couldn't think of a more fit end to our session 4 than that video that you shared. That was just excellent, because it's, we're trying to, work with nature, and nature is complex, and we don't have all the answers, but we do know a few answers that give us a good clue into what we can do next. And so we're happy to help anyone else out on that journey.
And what a great journey it is. Thank you for all your good work, Justin. Thank you, Carlos, for being the behind the scenes guy to make this thing run, and make sure that our slides move and we do evaluations. And Carlos has been so valuable as a support to make sure that this webinar happens. So thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Linda. And thank you, Justin. And for all of the participants, appreciate you. I love hearing your emails and responding and talking back and forth with some of the things that you guys are doing. Keep it up, and look forward to our if you're on our email list, you'll probably know next time we're doing something, and we'll dig into some more issues then. So thank you so very much, and enjoy your week, enjoy your summer, and happy grazing.